She's the co-editor of 2 volumes, Violence Performed, Local Roots and Global Roots of Conflict with Patrick Anderson, and Performing the Secular Religion, Representation and Politics with Dr. Amelia Gluhovic. She has published essays on Indian partition, diasporic feminist theater, political violence and performance, transnational queer theory, and neoliberal urbanism. Today, Professor Menon will be talking about art, activism, and agriculture, the farmers' protest, and the myth of universal cosmopolitanism. I invited Professor Jisha Menon on stage.
Thank you so much for that lovely, generous introduction. I remember meeting you in Washington, D.C. as well, and it was a very exciting time when we could see numerous people from the global south coming and being really present in these theater groups. I also want to thank Dean Asido and Dr. Ekuma for their lovely hospitality. From the book that Vishnupriya just mentioned, Brutal Beauty, Aesthetics and Aspiration, which focuses on the city and looks at the way in which neoliberal economic reforms transformed the cityscape and the ways in which artists were telling the story about a new transformed city, and especially looking at how discourses of beauty and particularly beautification projects in the city were transforming, the way in which we had inhabited the city space. So the transformation of the treescape, widening of cities, these mega projects of glass and chrome buildings that were really reformatting the city for us. And at the time I thought, I am not adequately looking at the rural. My focus has been so exclusively on the urban. And I felt that it was a real lost opportunity because the neoliberal economic reforms were obviously also impacting the countryside. And it had just kind of been a blind. Economic reforms in India also transformed the countryside and as urban and rural, because as we know, and with the migration, the mythology that suggests that a little bit. Is called Gauri Gill. She's a photographer, and this is Partscape. The drought-cracked earth shimmers, the thin loincloth he wears gathers around him loosely and disappears under his shirt. The warm glow of tell a different story. How do we read this uncanny assemblage of man and thing, of human and landscape, of performance and precarity? The grooves of strained lines etched into the mask amplify the vulnerability of small holdings farmers in regions that are continually devastated by drought. The cracked earth that engulfs the diminutive figure reminds us of the radical transformation of land itself, which is increasingly deprived of its resources and generativity. The image augurs the extreme uncertainty in agricultural Adivasi indigenous communities that contend with acute deprivation, loss of natural resources and traditional livelihoods, rising inflation, exposure to risk due to price fluctuations on the global market, and consequent indebtedness. The shrinking farming opportunities and unsustainable liabilities lead to mass migration and trigger widespread farmer suicides. The scenarios presented here offer a grim reminder of the collateral casualties of environmental change and neoliberal globalization in India. For Acts of Appearance, New Delhi-based photographer Gauri Gill collaborated with Subhash and Bhagwan Kadu, sons of the legendary craftsman Dharma Kadu, a renowned indigenous Adivasi artist from Konkona and Varli tribes in rural Maharashtra, along with 30 volunteers from their families and villages. And typically they create papier-mâché masks that depict indigenous and Hindu deities. During the annual Bohada mask procession and festival that has a history of about 250 years and is held annually in the month of May, local actors will get together from the village and don these masks and perform in mythological tales. In this festival, about 52 masks of Indian mythological figures are worn by performers who take part in the procession. One audience member describes it thus: charged with age-old charm, the nights in this Palghar town, known for its dependence on nature and traditional local healers, come alive with flaming mashals accompanying the vibrantly hued masked entities dancing with wild abandon to the beats of the sambal and the mesmerizing tune of Shehnai played by Varli musicians. Gauri Gill's acts of appearance refracts the mythological through the lens of the mundane. She proposed that Dharmakadu brothers lead their ensemble in creating a new set of masks that depict the everyday rather than the esoteric, the banal rather than the epic. From the ensuing conversations emerged a range of masks that depict the breadth of humdrum life in the village. Her photographs, taken with a manual analog camera, capture a new set of masks that celebrate the ordinary, and in the process explore questions of precarity and play in farming communities. Even as the masks capture the range and heterogeneity of village life, they are also the culmination of a creative process that brings together people of different ages, professions, genders, and economic strata of society. The masks are created by Dharmakadu, his brothers, and the whole community, and so they bear the trace of conversation and alliances between artists. In acts of appearance, Gauri Gill foregrounds creativity within these conditions of unrelenting harshness and austerity. The new set of secular masks depict a range of themes and subjects that capture the sentience and scarcity of everyday life. For example, the masks capture the 9 rasas, the typology of emotions in Natya Shastra, breaking out of the immobility and arrested fluidity of the traditional masks. These new masks convey the transformation of the body. As it passes from childhood to youth, adolescence, and old age. So it sort of captures this metamorphic body. And not content with just depicting gods, it also kind of radiates outwards, depicting animals, insects, things, and setting into motion a new horizontal relationality where non-human beings and things are luminous with vitality. Gill works with artists as well as volunteers drawn from the village to improvise, create scenes, and stage scenarios that she then photographs as tableaus of everyday life in the village. And she brings these elements into mise-en-scènes through a creative process where the actors tell their own stories and sort of create their own scenarios. But they do this while wearing the masks, so the whole time you actually don't have any easy access to their assumed interior subjectivity. The images are disquieting. The viewer may feel flustered or amused, curious or bewildered, intrigued or disconcerted. Do the masks enable their wearers to transcend the limits of given identities, to overcome the fixity of categories? Do they permit greater play, new roles to inhabit, new identities to don and doff at will? To what extent does the persona meld into the person? And are these even discrete categories? Or do persons and things, humans and their environments, exist in permeable and sinuous encounters? What new ecologies and relations do these masked figures animate and set into motion? With no clearly consumable or coherent objects for her gaze, the viewer then grapples with her own sense of disorientation. The masks estrange the viewers from the scene depicted. They interrupt our programmed expectation to view the farmer as an embodiment of the local. The deliberate insertion of artifice via the mask disrupts the typical organicist ways in which we think about the rootedness of the farmer. The mask forces us to see these subjects anew without habituated sentimentalism. They alienate any romantic sense of identification with or empathy for the hybrid subjects on display. And the photographs contain that gesture of refusal that thwart the eager gaze of the viewer and instead urges us to insert the farmer within an ecological imagination that is more than human and more than local. Acts of appearance traffics in this affective contradictoriness. The dub carries over to its affective ambiguity. Gill's photographs portray the breadth and range of life in farming communities and unsettle the prevalent ways in which we've come to. Locations for these images span from the hospital to the doctor's clinic, from the classroom to the home, from the neighborhood store to open fields. She has them in transit. Like here, a man, woman, and a bird on a motorcycle ride. She finds them in states of leisure and rest, a boy and these masked figures playing caroms, and then here they are playing a game of cards. So she, sort of captures them in various states of play. She also delineates the impoverished life of these communities in sickness and health, and just sort of the sheer variety of agrarian life diversifies the monolithic images with secure attachment to place, evoked through tropes that oscillate between peril and protest. So these images intertwine the human and non-human world and reveal privation and ordinariness that saturates these agrarian life worlds. She also starkly portrays the saturation of economic distress. This photo, for instance, is a kind of scenario of routinized risk introduced by economic inflation. A figure wearing a snake mask weighs onions in a grocery store, a gesture that conveys the rising costs of essential food items. This is revisited in this image, where three masked women are wearing these grim and forlorn expressions, pick out potatoes and onions from an open market. Or consider the queue that forms outside a bank, a scenario that forebodes the practices of predatory loans and consequent indebtedness that have led to mass suicides within farming communities. The economic disquiet conveyed in these images is exacerbated by environmental risks that are triggered by the dearth of water in agricultural communities. The score, rapidly drying riverbank. Here you have a masked woman sitting next to a picture of a crow with some empty water, a steel bucket. And again, here you have the image reinforcing the theme of water shortage and exposing the struggle and fragility of life lived in the shadow of drought. It also foregrounds the gendered dynamics of farming communities. Several images depict women performing tedious and incessant labor within the home and beyond, such as drawing water from wells, sweeping the floor, chopping vegetables. So Gill portrays the care economy that enables the social reproduction of labor while reminding us that a woman's work is never done. Even as she restores the health and of her husband and her family, her own life energy is depleted. So these scenarios from ordinary life diversify our monolithic image of the farmer, estranging and making us see anew multiple and routine acts of labor and leisure, custom and intimacy. The persistence of economic precarity within Adivasi farming communities ripples across the series and hints at the under a blazing sun. Figures, she evokes the shrinking economic opportunities which caused many villages with the farmer. That is a more predictable dimension of everyday life within farming communities. And beyond that, she also has all these images of objects. So in this barley painting in the afternoon sun, wearing the head of a Nataraj pencil, which was a very popular pencil used by numerous school children. And it reminds us that this ordinary thing that we have sharpened and shaped has also shaped us, schooled our grasping fingers, and choreographed our signatures that now mark our status as singular and non-fungible persons. So I start this talk with a discussion of Gauri Gill's photographic depictions. that grapple with economic and ecological precarity in rural India. While the photographs point to numerous scenes of precarity and performance, they don't offer any easy access into the subjectivity of the photographed subjects. They work to estrange us from received notions of the gender and caste hierarchies that pervade it. It insists on making visible poverty, structural hardship, centric horizon to emerge. Gill offers this kind of more complex way of thinking about the farmer. While the farmer is indispensable for food systems, they are also the biggest casualty of multinational globalization. There are nearly 500 million smallholder food consumed in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, and a large part of the food is produced worldwide. Globally, small holdings farmers lose their land as large-scale investments move in and import textured understandings of the many dimensions of the problems that beset farming communities. The images portray that kind of breadth. While the artists have attended to urban transformation that I captured, that I write about in Brutal Beauty, the attention to rural changes has not, been reported or sort of talked about as much. Farmer suicides have risen even as numbers of farmers have shrunk. Between 1995 and 2018, the National Crime Bureau logged about 400,000 farmers committed suicide. This translates to approximately suicides every day. The majority of suicide is Raj Patel's moving account of the sense of desperation and despair in the life of Parvati must stop making disposable plates from leaves does not pay enough to sustain her and her young children aged 6 and 8. She says, I used to put chilies in their food in order to make it last longer. So they would eat slowly and feel like they had enough. And she says she doesn't blame anyone. She says, I'm not angry. What would be the point? Her husband, Kistaya, had been sinking deeper into debt for 4 years before he took his own life. The rains had become erratic and the groundwater had disappeared. Trying to grow rice, he had taken out loans to drill for water, initially borrowing from a local bank and then borrowing from the local moneylender. He'd sunk 3 holes across his land and none had struck groundwater. The rains still hadn't come. His crops were dying in the fields. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Kistaya filled a cup with granules of a toxic pesticide and drank it. Then he lay down next to Parvati. It entered Kistaya's body while he was still mixing it, passing through his lungs even before it reached his lips. It jammed the receptors in his nerves. His respiratory muscles became paralyzed. He likely slipped into a coma before succumbing to asphyxia. He can't have convulsed very hard. He died without waking his wife or 2 sons. This is an account in Raj Patel's book, Stuffed and Starved. Such harrowing accounts are routine across farming communities in India and have only become more extreme since Raj Patel wrote this account in 2011. The journalist P. Sainath has been writing for decades about agrarian distress. He lists a range of factors that precipitate agrarian crises in liberalized India. The increase in cultivation costs, corporate control of seeds, fertilizers, and pesticides, the agricultural credit policies that favor businesses rather than individual farmers. The public sector banks have turned away from farmers, forcing them to borrow from lenders who are charging exorbitant interest. That, combined with climate uncertainty, unpredictable monsoons, rigged markets, and severe water crises, produce conditions of extreme precarity. The turning point in Indian agriculture sector can be traced back to the sweeping and enduring transformations wrought by the Green Revolution in India. The Green Revolution was a transnational intervention spearheaded by Rockefeller Foundation and the Mexican government in 1940s. They advocated scientific methods and a top-down production strategy to improve food output. The seeds of agricultural transformation were planted during the introduction of Green Revolution policies in the late 1960s, which reinvigorated earlier colonialist and national policies on the role of science and technology to improve agricultural productivity. Green Revolution policies were celebrated as ushering in a new era of independence in Mexico's agricultural production and its ability to solve the problem of food productivity through technocratic solutions. In the wake of failed monsoons in India over 2 years, which impacted agricultural output, the Indian government welcomed Green Revolution. In an effort to replicate the agricultural innovations in Mexico, Rockefeller Foundation experts visited India in the early 1950s to assess the situation and then entered into an agreement with the Indian government to assist in the improvement in a variety of crops, including maize and millet, although the big breakthrough came through wheat. However, the Green Revolution entrenched existing inequities by privileging regions that were rich in resources and promoted larger farmers with bigger farms and greater capacity to take advantage of the new technology. The itinerary of the Green Revolution tells us the story of transnational alliances. An exemplary template was derived from agricultural research done in the US, which then became the modular form that guided efforts in the developing world. The success of the Green Revolution motivated an international agricultural consortium to spur incentives to globalize Green Revolution and bring it to other tropical regions in the developing world. While the dominant mythology imagines the farmer's life as intractably local, international collaborations and transnational processes have greatly impacted farmers' lives. Transnational capital and policies pervade farms and alter the lives and livelihoods of farmers. So there's an undeniable connection between transnational in terms of national self-sufficiency. So the nation is supposed to be responsible for feeding its own population. But such thinking reinforces the primacy of the nation as the bounded unit for imagining solutions to problems that are actually trans-regional. So the singular template deployed to solve problems of world hunger in regions with heterogeneous ecological, political, and social landscapes allows us to see how the Green Revolution program sought to solve the problem of world hunger through a template that universalized its own particularity. Timothy Brennan has argued that cosmopolitanism is a discourse of the universal, which is inherently local. Moreover, it is a locality that is surreptitiously imperial. He cautions that the discourse of cosmopolitanism enables the expansion and encroachment of metropolitan centers into geopolitically dispersed outlying regions. This kind of cosmopolitanism then naturalizes and universalizes that very particular norms and attachments that are then just sort of exported to other nations. So we can see some of that particularity in this situation where the Green Revolution is eager to export its technocratic solutions to problems of world hunger. Recent economic reforms have further exacerbated the policies that were already put in place by the Green Revolution. The liberalization of the Indian economy in 1991 opened the door to foreign trade and investment and launched a range of economic reforms, including deregulation, privatization, tax reforms, and inflation controlling measures that shifted the country from a developmental state to a more capitalist economy. These transformations also impacted the agricultural sector. So on average, every day, close to 2,000 people in India abandon farming. In 2011, India's national census recorded 15 million fewer farmers than there were in 1991. The multiple effects of India's agrarian crisis include footloose migration, the despair-driven exodus from the countryside, resulting in the collapse of millions of livelihoods in agriculture and related occupations. The agrarian crisis in India derives from this dual heritage, from both the top-down cosmopolitanism of Green Revolution and the more recent neoliberal economic reforms. So that's the backdrop of the more current transformations in agrarian policy. To fast forward to today, in September 2020, the Modi government passed 3 farm laws which triggered mass protests across the country. The protest began in November 2020 in the northern Indian states of Punjab and Haryana, likely the largest organized strike in human history. The role of government from the agricultural sector, deregulate the sale, pricing, and storage of goods, enabling farmers to participate in contract farming and sell their goods to private buyers, and allowed the government to set some standard prices at which to buy crops. So farmers protested the new farm laws that sought to liberalize India's agricultural sector and terminate the government's annual procurement of wheat at the minimum support price, or the MSP. The new laws would remove the minimum price guarantee and regulated wholesale mandi market system, thus exposing farmers to the vagaries of the unregulated free market and intensify the hold of private companies. Farmers marched to the capital to protest laws they believed would further exacerbate their precarious living conditions and demanded ongoing state support through MSPs and loan waivers. The government deploys the rhetoric of freedom to promote the new laws. They argue that the laws will allow farmers greater freedom to negotiate better prices for their crops. Yet the farmers fear that dismantling the mandi market will end the MSPs, without which farmers would be at the mercy of private companies who would have no obligation to pay them their minimum prices. The so-called freedom from state intervention may instead empower private buyers who would then potentially ensnare farmer buyer, and he can or she can dictate crop prices that would just exacerbate the precarity of the farmers. So while the Green Revolution sets up from below, which I find really heartening and encouraging, and this is the heterogeneous groups of artists and scholars and activists who supported the farmers' movement, who evince a different vision of global solidarity. So farmers organized their struggle to protest the overbearing imposition of this one universal solution to a bunch of very heterogeneous, diverse, regional problems, while hoping that this would solve world hunger, but instead it entrenches inequities. At the same time that ordinary people are taking to the streets. So moving away from the abstract universalism of cosmopolitanism, this kind of eco-cosmopolitanism, which moves us toward global struggle and solidarity, and what Ursula Heisa, former colleague of mine at Stanford, has described as eco-cosmopolitanism, is a kind of environmental world citizenship. While local attachments play a central role in environmental struggles, eco-cosmopolitanism allows us to move beyond nation-bound understandings to see the emergence of new solidarities that are not rooted in just one place. So ecologically based advocacy on behalf of non-human world climate justice may be premised on ties not to local places, but to a more encompassing notion of planetary commons. So how do we think about cosmopolitan practice in the context of rapidly changing cultural and political scenes that are ushered in by the twin forces of neoliberal capitalism and state authoritarianism? How are local ecological crises produced by transnational policies and exacerbated by neoliberal technologies? And how are solidarities forged that are at once anchored in place but cosmopolitan in spirit and force? And what do these emergent solidarities across disparate networks, which include disenfranchised farmers, members of the diaspora, artist collectives, tell us about new cosmopolitan formations from below? These questions are taken up by the artists who look specifically at transformations wrought by neoliberal economic policies within agricultural communities. So a diverse group of protesters joined the farmers' struggle, including the Punjabi diaspora in the US, Canada, UK, other regions. The protests echoed with the activist efforts of La Via Campesina, an international coalition that brings together farmers, peasants, landless workers, indigenous and dispossessed migrant workers across the world in a defense of small farmers' holdings for food sovereignty. In the US, a written petition by 87 farmers' unions supported the ongoing Indian farmers' protests, and the petition held accountable US, Australia, Canada, and European allies for opposing Indian farmers' demands for a standard MSP. The unions berated the Biden administration and urged them to make agricultural policies conducive to farmers. The petition recalled a very similar scenario in the US during the Reagan administration, at which time also there were mass suicides across American farmers, asking to sort of systematically erode parity prices that sort of protested that. As a result of which larger agribusiness farming operations with means to consolidate were rewarded for growing monoculture commodities and leaving behind smaller farmers, independent family farmers, indigenous communities, and others who had shifted to diversified agroecological farming. The farmers' protest drew together all of these different constituents in a very powerful, did youth, Dalits, Jats, educated and uneducated farmers, brokers, and the landless. They came to the capital, they sang their songs, protested. There was just an incredible energy and vitality, and it just inspired an enormous sense of faith in the power of ordinary people to effect changes. Residents across the world with farming communities, artists also joined the movement. In Kerala, in southern India, organized by the White Rose Movement, which is a group that works toward anti-fascism in India and takes its name from White Rose Movement, was calling out the current government for their farm laws that jeopardize the lives of the farmers. Many conveyed the struggles of the Indian farmers, at once situated and global. These artists of social media, the farmers' protest attained global visibility and brought the issue to the attention of a larger audience. Passive and pugnacious rhythms, occasional gunshots out to me that Poojan Sahil has done an adaptation of to protest the harsh working conditions and a kind of anti-fascist. This is a Bhangra group that does rap music and has a range of influences from traditional percussion drums to dhol to Punjabi lyrics to African American influences of hip hop and gang groove. Music producers and DJs who remix Bhangra, Desi, hip hop and R&B to create their tempo of Bhangra music, Boliyan, with spliced documentary audio of speeches delivered during the farmers' protests. The video shows footage from the protests, discohering and fracturing the frame into diptychs, and like the form of the music itself, finds its harmony through decomposition, recombination, and remixing of instrumentations, sampled lyrics that are layered over, looped, and orchestrated. The images likewise are fragmented, pixelated, manipulated, and drawn from documentary sources, showing both farmers' resistance and police pushback, visually citing the Black Lives Matter protests, and a range of other references from Godi Media to Kangana Ranaut and just a wide range of other visual and sonic repertoire that combines both a brooding sense of repressed tension and this masculinist edge with rhythms and tempo. And so sort of creating this kind of sonic cosmopolitanism by making music the channel for enacting a form of global solidarity. In response to the farmers' protests, this Vancouver-based theatre company, Conspiracy Theatre, mounted Is Democracy Dead? Spearheaded by artistic director and actor Gavan Chima. The show was performed in Studio Theatre in Surrey Arts Centre in September 2021. Chima wanted to bring the show to Surrey because it is home to a sizable Sikh community. And it's a company that puts on experimental and participatory productions. And so it utilized an interactive documentary-style theater that urged audiences to participate in the show and learn more about the farmers' protest. So she was eager to use live theater, which would enable in-person encounters between audience members. This, she felt, would redress some of the heightened and polarizing rhetoric that dominates social media. So it's a theater show that kind of unfolds as part interactive game, part social discussion, and part theatrical performance, and focuses on the farmers' struggle, and audiences interact with, click on, and learn more about what's going on. So in her words, and she's a first-generation Canadian of immigrant parents from Punjab, and she says, we still have family in India, some of whom are farmers, or we have family who have left farming to come here. This issue affects so many people in our population It is the largest global protest in a democratic country. It just feels like something that is pressing, and we need to give people a platform to discuss this issue and unpack all the information. Through an artistic form that leans into contemporary youth cultures of gaming and social media, Theatre Conspiracy uses opportunities provided by these forums to initiate discussions where audience members learn about the farmers' protests, engage in critical conversations, and emerge better informed. And in her theater, the audience models a kind of deliberative democracy. Conversations enable people to encounter differences and foster a more cosmopolitan imaginary, where they link their actions with larger reverberations across the world. The intimate scale of the theater venue enables us to hone our cosmopolitan imagination and awaken a sense of responsibility towards others not in our immediate social circles. This attempt repurposes contemporary social media to serve democratic aims and create a global public sphere. While Cray Twins and Chima's immediate motivation to address farmer struggles comes from their own positionality as diasporic Punjabis with ethnic ties to farmers in Punjab, I want to suggest that these acts of artistic solidarity allow us to move beyond thinking about cosmopolitanism as only the affective orientation or sensibility of diasporic subjects. The farmer is summoned in these artistic interventions as someone who belongs to a more cosmopolitan horizontal category and evokes a sense of shared solidarity that cuts across national differences. These artists craft Asian identities in the diaspora by negotiating racial, ethnic, national, and gender belonging through art forms that they produce and consume while simultaneously enacting cosmopolitan solidarity with people in their countries of origin. So moving away from binary models of assimilation and resistance, these artists express solidarity with the farmers' protests that reveal a much more dynamic, processual, and supple engagement with notions of home and world. The artistic interventions in the farmers' protest demonstrated the cosmopolitan visions of global solidarity were vibrant within India. And I want to just turn to Maya Rao as a concluding kind of performance. She's, of course, as you know, an iconic Indian feminist performer. And Professor Bishnupriya Ghosh has just written something really remarkable about her work as well. The iconic, so she created this piece called Naam Hai Aurat, or My Name is Woman, and it's a short 5-minute vignette in Hindi, which she performed on Women's Farmers' Day at the border, Singhu border, and in her kind of signature style, combining the precision and pulsating energy of Kathakali, the edgy groove of spoken word poetry and haunting music, composed by Sumant Balakrishnan, she creates a kind of sketch of the power of farmers. Naam Hai Aurat is an electric performance infused with verve, vitality, and spirit that combines gesture, word, and music to affirm and celebrate the physical and affective labor, resilience, and fortitude of women farmers. This piece pays tribute to the strength and fierceness of these farmers who are often relegated as marginal within the masculinist ethos of the farmers' movement. She reinforces the entwinement of the female body and landscape to produce startling hybrid images. Rao delineates how women farmers cultivate qualities like grit and vitality and graft them to their heart as if they were carefully harvesting crops from the field. Through whirling gesture, she conveys the more than human force of these women who reshape their bodies sartorially and somatically to suit the demands of hard physical labor. She entwines reproduction and social reproduction, bodies and landscape, while also critically depicting how agriculture is produced for bodies, how agriculture is not just produced for bodies, but how bodies are shaped to meet the demands of agriculture. The image of the female farmer underlines the economies of care that sustain agricultural labor. Reinforcing the physicality of these women, Rao draws attention to their labor on the fields that affects embodiment. She advocates a different understanding of the laws of the land that transcend the rule of law by reminding the audience of the social reproduction of labor, the indispensable yet devalued work within care economies, and the generativity of agriculture that is interwoven with the hard physical labor and emotional labor performed by these women. The protests and transnational artworks that emerged in its wake made visible the figure of the farmer whose struggles are amplified through the artworks of diasporic artists such as Gavan Chima and Cray Twins, nuanced in the photo series of Gauri Gill, where the figure of the farmer is at once particular but also planetary, and speaks to the implication of transnational processes in the production of local agrarian distress. Maya Rao inserts the farmer into an imaginary that revalues the centrality of the care economy that fuels and sustains social reproduction and enables us to imagine radical egalitarian communities of care. The acts of solidarity from farmers to artists and activists across the world signal the emergence of an eco-cosmopolitanism not as an individualistic liberal practice within an ethical horizon, but as a shared political struggle and collective vision in a world that is teeming with cultural differences. These artistic practices in India and overseas enact solidarity with the farmers' marches and draw attention to our responsibility toward others beyond our immediate kith and kin. The artists, activists, and farmers invoked a shared vision that link together multiple local struggles into a powerful demand that pushes against neoliberal policies that are redefining agrarian lives and their relationship to the land. The protests and the artistic and political towards greater horizons of justice. Thank you.
Jisha will take questions. There's some time, so anybody who, yes. Do you have a mic? Is there a mic?
Sure, yeah, let's do that.
Hello, sorry. Hi, Jisha. Thank you for that expansive talk on the Green Revolution. Pushes back the genealogy of that event into the colonial period and suggests that American-Indian relations have heavily affected how that played out. So it's not so much neoliberal break as a kind of continuation of colonial policies in a different kind of form. And so I wonder if that means that the notion of cosmopolitanism also has to be nuanced for a different kind of temporal formation than what eco-cosmopolitanism.
A really important point, because I think there are quite a few debates, because the notion of the Anthropocene seems to just, sort of humanize this particular anthropos as the sort of cause of environmental and climate catastrophe. And of course, we know that it wasn't all humans who created the catastrophe. Some humans have to take more responsibility than others. As Sean is rightly suggesting, this has a very long arc. In fact, the imbrication of empire and capital would be, Andreas Malm has work on the sort of fossil empire thinking that then went across, so that we're not too presentist with the neoliberal is an important reminder. And I think that's absolutely, I think the neoliberal and then subsequently nationalist policies. Yeah, first.
Hi, thank you so much. That was, yes, very expansive and a wonderful talk. I liked particularly your invocation of solidarity, the importance. I mean, I was curious what, your observations in that movement in Pakistan, in Punjab also, and which was spearheaded, it sort of delivered, just explain further the ways, what larger movements, feminist movements, left movements, particularly in India, you locate the farmers' movement within, because certainly across the border in Pakistan, the Anjuman Mazareen of Punjab, that was a class-based leftist movement. And we really can trace it back to the British colonial sort of plans, which were then later taken up by the name of that movement, was actually trying to argue much less, this ability of the time. Yes, if there are other solidarities, which is what the farmers' movements are.
And I think more recently, efforts, just cross-border efforts, and for the farmer, there's obviously a connection in this particular kind of agricultural economy, sense of place-based identity, bigger kind of planetary landscape itself, right? Climate change. So climate change has also contributed, and that is the thing simultaneously between the local, but also think about the planetary, which takes us beyond the soil and the sort of specificity of place, but to step back and think a little bit about unities that would require and received from just across the board in La Via Campesina.
We can take a couple more.
And I'm almost politicism from below, where planetary, the Kranoa, and among, I put that, for otherwise I'm not able to write about it, the celebratory back laughter is unfolding, my sort of perspective that you brought to the movement, but you've alerted us to the fact that but thank you for mapping all these bandwidth into the devastations of suicide.
Thank you, Rustam. Pushed against that. So I also share that issue that we have with what has been mass rhetoric of globality, when in fact the agenda is serving out different ways of counter movements from below, which we, right? And I think that's sure that relationship with the social, and that's where the eco-cosmopolitanism comes in, where you're thinking about the more than human and the more than local. So it becomes a kind of global solidarity. And so that way, when you have US farmers who are writing to support global problem, that to see it in terms of its global dimensions will force us to come up with global challenge for us is how can we take that universalism that we've been so critical of and now think about a planet, right, that we don't want that kind of universalism that's a Eurocentric kind of vision, which is a kind of imperial agenda.
Thank you so much. I mean, so many very powerful images and also information and ideas sold as a kind of freedom. That's one thing I'm taking away. And also this idea of an eco-cosmopolitanism from below. I guess what I'm interested in following up on that is the artist's role. So I want to go back to the very first set of photographs that you started with, which were so powerful, and some will say actual lightly concerned by the idea of artists creating spaces of appearances for people who actually exist and do not need a process in which they participated in the creation of these images. So if you could...
I can go back to some of those. He's a photographer who started her with the community, gets to know. She has this extraordinary process, collaborator throughout this process. She's collaborating, and she's very insistent that you don't say she's collaborating with the two, Bhagwan, Kadu brothers. She's like, you have to say that it's the community. So there are the wives, the children, and they will come up with the scenarios. So she won't tell them, she's not directing them. They'll tell her, because she's using those mythological masks, and then she wants them to do something that's about their life, their everyday life. And she says, you come up with the themes, you come up with the scenarios, and I'm just going to photograph. And then when they're exhibited, she also ensures that whatever money she makes goes to them as well, because they are collaborators. This is the Warli community. She's worked with another Warli artist who does Warli. You'll see, she has a website, and she's a tree-style photographer, so you will have a really strong sense of realism, especially the Rajasthan series, which was her first series. This young girl who passed away in the desert, and around, even the sort of, these were 20 years. So it's a very deep and engaged her generosity to the people she's working with. And she was actually, I had a chance to talk to her, That's what I want people to take away from telling you what you should be doing. It's a dialogic engagement, and that's, you know.
Thank you so much, Jisha. These alternate spaces where protests, people's lives.
We have some two tickets for the pop productions. That's one of the very current Ghanaian in Ghana. And perform. That is also in Osun, in the School of Performing Arts. So those who want to stay on campus and go for I think it's a very spiritual experience. I can't remember the title just off the top of my head right now. Yeah. And then there's an important, the third and final keynote. And it will take place here. Okay, to take place here. And the closing ceremony will be the last event in the Great Hall. Okay, the Great Hall was not available today and tomorrow, so we came here. So we go back to the Great Hall on Friday for the closing ceremony at 4 p.m. Yeah. So thank you very much for your attention. Well, a question? But the popular theater one is not sold out. If you want to have a good laugh, available for the Secret Code of Wives, a fun production. So please join us. And we'll have some time to interact with the artists